Welcome to our third conversation about Venezuela. We are talking today about sanctions and what effects these have had on the Venezuelan people. So we've got a series of questions that we're going to answer. And first of all, I'd like to introduce Joe. He's my co-host with me. My name's Helen, and we've been doing these for the last couple of months. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and of the Kulin Nation, and that this country was never ceded. So the first question we want to look at is we understand that Venezuela is a country that has been sanctioned by the United States. So the first question we really need to ask is, and to understand is, what are sanctions? And so, Joe, would you like to have a crack at that?
Yeah, but sanctions are most widely understood. Quite obviously, it's the imposition of restrictions or stopping exports and imports of a country. In Venezuela's case, the main impact has been over the years that they've been on has been on the supply of food. Venezuela requires to import a great deal of its food, and sanctions have created food shortages. And the other one is medicines. Obviously, people to stay healthy need medicines, and the sanctions have stopped medicines from coming in. So that's, in a nutshell, what at the basic level, what sanctions are.
Yeah, and it has to be added that the sanctions are generally imposed because countries are acting outside of the interests of mainstream dominant the economic system. Generally, they demand their independence from the main dominant economic system, and this is the fact that this is the reason or the cause of the sanctions. And can sanctions you often hear the words democracy. These countries are acting against human rights and democracy, and so they impose these sanctions on countries that are independent. They have a different economic system, and they're looking at a different democracy.
Well, I suppose to add to that, start from the basics. Karl von Clausewitz, if I pronounce the name correctly, he was a German general, a brilliant strategist, uh, and he was around during the time before and during the time of the First World War. Uh, he described any kind of warfare, which includes sanctions, I'll come to this, as the continuation of politics by another means. And that really, we really need to understand that statement, because every every act, whether it's in the world of diplomacy, in sanctions, or in warfare, is tied to a political objective. So they're parts of a continuum that leads towards a political objective. So, in that sense, the political objective of sanctions is to change the government of another country. So, in that sense, yes, it is a form of warfare. It's a
Absolutely.
shift away from diplomacy and putting forward, through conversation, a view of how things should be to try. It's an escalation towards the use of force.
Yeah.
And we have seen this in history. The imposition of sanctions, unfortunately, has often been a prelude to a shooting war.
And I think it's worth mentioning at this point that that they've been around for quite a while, but more used recently, and not just by countries, but also not just by the United Nations, who was the initial user of these sanctions, but now we see countries imposing really loosely, and for whatever reasons or excuses they come up with, they impose sanctions on other countries. And of course, the United States is the main country that is targeting other countries around the world for sanctions. It has to be said that the United Nations just recently said that sanctions are illegal. Um, they're contrary to international law, international humanitarian law, the Charter, and the norms and principles that govern peaceful relations among states. So that comes back to that issue that you were just talking about in terms of it being a continuation of war by other means. But to recognise that the United Nations now is saying that these sanctions they're illegal in terms of international law, and the effect that they have is to harm the people that least can afford it, in terms of the people on the ground, the grassroots people that get hit by sanctions, by the lack of medicine or by the lack of food that the countries can't import as a result of the sanctions. So it's recognised that sanctions aren't particularly effective at creating a regime change, but really damage the well-being and the health of the ordinary people. So, leading on from that, Joe, in terms of countries being able to get hold of international goods and trade, how does sanctions affect currency and the transfer of money?
I mean, a legal principle in the United Nations supposed to be founded on, of course, is that each nation has a right to make its own choices as far as its own policy, where it's heading towards. Sanctions are directly a counter to that. They are designed to stop that very principle from operating and impose the will of another nation. So that's the thing. Now, in connection with the financial system, that if we go back, because it's been applied before, and the great case was after the First World War on Germany during the period of the Weimar Republic. The financial system of Germany was destroyed, and it created the conditions which led to World War II. Immense poverty, lack of food, lack of medicines. Yeah, the same things. It was there were sanctions, but also manipulation of the currency and excluding Germany from financial transactions. This is what's happening now, because a big part of the sanctions regime is to block payments, and so Venezuela cannot import or export what it needs because it can't make payments. It's also had an effect internally in two ways. One is the blocking of internal payments as well, because through the sanctions regime, a bank that processes transactions internally also in Venezuela is subject to losing contracts. But there's also the manipulation of the currency. And particularly these days in the computer age, it is quite easy to uh, to create money on a scale that will create massive hyperinflation. And this happened to Venezuela. It happened during the Weimar Republic as well. You know, you hear stories that people had to carry a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread. In Venezuela, they talk about paying with a brick, you know, big stack of notes. It's a similar thing, and yeah, it is a tremendously important part of the use of sanctions. Of course, we see that being tried to be applied in the case of Ukraine at the moment. So that too is part of this warfare aspect of sanctions.
Yeah. And my understanding is also that the likes of Visa and MasterCard control so much of the international transactions that um, uh, they can put a stop to any transactions that occur internationally through their system. And of course, we see nowadays that and I think it's called the Swift system.
Yes.
Now we see that other countries are developing their own means of transactions to get around the dominance of these institutions, and so we're seeing more and more that these sanctions actually aren't effective, and they're pushing countries more and more into developing new systems, and therefore boycotting what already exists. So it's a major contradiction for the dominance of one system over another, and the conclusion of it is going to affect the entire world. Um, so why do sanctions get imposed? I think we kind of touched on that a wee bit
Yeah,
earlier, but maybe we could elaborate on that a bit further.
yeah. Well, I said before, it's to achieve a political objective, and in this case, is of Venezuela, it is to have a different government there. Bottom line, on that question before of the of the international payment system, uh, the current one was introduced after World War II, is what's called the Bretton Woods system, and it is dominated by certain institutions, the World Bank and the World Trade Organization. There are the SWIFT system. There are a few other institutions, and they have been since that time under the control. Really, the big force behind it, or the big power, is the United States. They've controlled the the banking system that operates through Bretton Woods and allows credit, allows payments, and so on. The the downside of imposing sanctions, what we're trying to see now, that it precisely what you said, Helen, it forces the victims of sanctions to look for alternatives. And in the case of countries suffering it now, they start trading with each other more. We've got the case of Venezuela increasing its trade with Iran, for instance, of increasing its trade with Russia, with China, and with other countries that are also finding certain difficulties and need to find arrangements. And it may be, and there is a potential that the imposition of sanctions, the United States has imposed sanctions in well over 30, 34 or something countries that have been pushed in this direction. It may well be undermining the the international or the global financial system which it currently controls.
Yeah, yeah,
And one recognition of this is that the countries that are looking for ways out of restrictions, and it's only one part, have shifted to creating their own digital currencies. That's government digital currencies. Uh, Recently, the United States government itself has been put in a position where they've created or in the process of creating their own digital American dollar. And the reason for this is that the fewer countries that are using the American dollar for trade, the lower the exchange value of the American dollar goes. You know, and it is one of not the only one. It's one of the factors behind the rise of inflation right now.
yeah. Venezuela has over. It's one of the most heavily sanctioned countries in the world. It has over 600 sanctions applied to it. So that's either through products or transactions or through the things that they can export, but also people are being sanctioned, and that's not just in Venezuela, but also around the world. There, the powers that be are not only sanctioning countries, but they're now sanctioning individuals. And the interesting thing about these sanctions is that they don't go through a real they don't go through the international body, the UN, to say, is this a fair and just thing that we're doing? Should we be imposing these sanctions on this country? But instead, now they're able to pass laws in their own country. So, in the case of the United States, which is the country that does the most sanctioning, they pass laws in their own country to sanction either individuals or countries. And So more and more, the United States may be seen as acting with individualistically and within its own interest, rather than looking at it being an international issue, and of course that in and of itself could create isolation for the United States. And I think more and more we're actually seeing that the United States politically is being isolated, and so once again, for the international community, this is we're going to see major changes over the next few years, I would suggest.
Yeah, I think there's these problems, this shift towards individual sanctioning really began at the beginning, where businesses who who dealt with Venezuela were threatened. Do business there, we will take business away from you. So that set the tone. And that is my understanding. That's also illegal according to international law, because the same thing, it is not so much to punish the individuals, but to put pressure on governments and to use as a propaganda platform to discredit governments. Where, for instance, the current case of Venezuelan Ambassador Alex Saab, who's in the United States, who was extradited illegally, according to the African Union, where it was one of their nations. He was extradited from, and according to international law, really any law, for somebody to be kidnapped, effectively bound on a plane and taken to the United States to face trial, who's not even a citizen of that country. But it's Alex Saab as an ambassador. Now they want to charge him with money laundering, and the reason why is because part of his job as an ambassador was trade deals, but also work out payments for trade. And because he was involved in that, in carrying out his function as an ambassador, he has been, or they're saying they're going to charge him with money laundering because it's a breach of the United States sanctions. Under international law, there's diplomatic immunity as well. It is illegal to charge an ambassador for carrying out the functions of their government. Secondly, when they're involved in carrying out their functions, they're under their own national law.
Yeah.
So they shouldn't be doing this. But the purpose, again, it's not to punish Alex Saab, but to pressure policy change of the Venezuelan government, which is blatantly anti-democratic, because under any definition of democracy, that it is those who are Venezuelan citizens who are supposed to have the say on what the policy of their nation is.
Yeah. I think we can see the level of hypocrisy even in the fact that the United States says that it wants regime change, so that because the Venezuelan regime is violating human rights, or that it's undemocratic, and yet you see the United States imposing sanctions that are harming people in Venezuela, which is directly a violation of human rights. And here we have the United States kidnapping people when they're carrying out their functions, by an elected government, and yet the United States says, well, it does undemocratic things such as kidnap diplomats and so on when it suits them. So I think one of the other questions that we should move on and ask is, how has the Venezuelan government responded to the sanctions?
In various ways. I mean, first of all, they have said, we're not giving in. I mean, everything's lost in that sense if you give in. So there hasn't been a change of government. So clearly they've failed in that respect, and it's each day is less likely to succeed. Uh, but also that it's the government's responded in two ways. It's responded by building relationships with nations that are prepared still to trade. For instance, Iran has continued to send oil. Occasionally, it gets commandeered, but some oil has still gotten through. Uh, there, China has also sent some, I believe, some oil as well, but other supplies. Russia has, South Africa, I think, various other countries have been able to get through. Still hasn't solved the problem. There's still been significant shortages, but certainly it has eased the pain somewhat. But there's also the internal arrangements where encouraging the population to get involved, to build alternatives, to build their own capacity to produce. There have been, and there still needs to be a lot more. There has been attention to diversifying the economy, and being able to depend a bit less on imports. Uh, there has also been what's called the CLAP program, where basic necessities are provided to households, pretty much free of charge, which has at least met the nutritional needs of the population. So that's how the government has responded. And by doing these things, it's been able to strengthen the level of support it has from the population. I have to say that originally, when the sanctions were extended around 2016, that a section of the population, this is hard. Anything's better than this. Because don't forget, they over the previous decade, they had become accustomed to a rising standard of living, and people had uh, material things that they didn't have before. And everything was looking quite good. And suddenly this was pulled out, and it was very hard, very painful. So there was an element of instability, but this has been able to be sorted out. Uh, but the main way of fighting really has been, besides building international links slowly, is consolidating the support of the population.
Mm. I think I think that point about international relations is quite important, and we see now that there's becoming an alternative bloc to the dominant financial system, and that being those countries, and it stands to reason that the countries that are sanctioned by the United States would have to form some kind of alliance with each other to develop trade. You cannot allow your population to starve, and you cannot allow your population to be not have medical and education. So these countries that are fighting for their independence from the international financial system are now forming blocks. And you were talking about 2016, when the sanctions were probably really at their, in terms of the impact they had on the people. The Venezuelan government was still able to build 3 million new homes. And we now are going into elections, and our government cannot provide homes for people here in Australia, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and one of the most heavily taxed countries in terms of the working class being taxed. And yet we are having increasing numbers of homelessness. We know that houses need to be built. It's high on the agenda of the politicians, but are we going to see any being built? That will be yet to be seen. And watch that page, because here we have a highly sanctioned country that is able to build 3 million homes for its people and provide food and medicine, even at a most basic level, even if it might not be as advanced as we have. But it does its best to try and provide for its people, even under those heavy sanctions.
You know that the key really there is that people are doing better as a result of the response. It's still tough, but there has been a turnaround this year, and I think that's really worthwhile noting. The For the first time since the sanctions were imposed, the economy has started to grow over the last few months. The
Yeah.
currency has significantly stabilized. Hyperinflation is a thing of the past now, and it's it's strengthened the position of the government. It's also lifting the living standards. Reports are now that the supermarkets are full. Well, ours, I was going to say like ours, but they're starting to empty again. There's a toilet paper problem I've noticed has just emerged, and a few other things. So, so that's a significant turnaround. On top of that, uh, given the events in Ukraine, the United States has sought talks to access Venezuelan oil. And although these have been held in secret and we don't know the details as they are going at the moment, the United States really wants the oil and are prepared to cut deals. They've offered. We don't know what will materialise. At least some lifting of the sanctions. So if that is achieved, then that's going to make things a lot easier. And what I was going to say before was that in line with the real purpose of the sanctions is to change the government. The sanctions are not directed primarily against politicians and certain people who get named. They are directed at the population. They always are.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if they weren't, you will not prevent access to food and medicines to start off with. Because, you know, a minister or prime minister is not going to starve to death because there are sanctions on. But people at the bottom of the pyramid, the poorest people in society, are the ones who are going to most likely starve. They're the ones who are going to miss out on health care before anyone else. It's directed against them. It is punishment in one side, punishment for supporting a government not approved by Washington. But it's also pressure on these people, the population, to turn on this government and accept anything in order to get the sanctions lifted.
Yeah.
And it's abundantly clear that it hasn't worked. What it has done is is added fuel to the anger of the population against the United States, not so much the government.
Yeah.
And it's
No.
recognised. And I think one thing of these talks, one thing is that the self-declared presidents, one Guaido, there's so much publicity. He was the real president of Venezuela. They bypassed him. He was talking to Nicolas Maduro.
I think that's a good point about the fact that it's that sanctions are really designed to as a coercive measure against the population to try and get them to rally against the government and against the new system that they've clearly been part of developing. Um, and I think that leads to the next question, which we were going to ask: well, how have the people of Venezuela responded? And I just want to launch in here with the fact that just last year elections were held, and they were municipal and regional elections, and the people of Venezuela elected, the majority of them were elected from the PSUV, which is the ruling party in Venezuela. And I think that confirms once again that uh, the people are strongly behind the party that is in power now. Nicolas Maduro is the leader of that party, and once again, I think that confirms that he is the legitimate leader of the country. And as much as the Western world would like to say that these elections are fraudulent, that they've been manipulated, and all the rest of the things that they come up with, the fact is that the PSUV has been voted in over the last 20 years on a regular basis, and opposition members stand in these elections. They're able to be voted in, and they have been voted in some of the areas, but the vast majority of the people vote for the PSUV. And I think that's important as well. So that's the response of the ordinary people to these sanctions. And I think that goes back to what you were saying, Joe, where in actual fact, these sanctions, rather than having a detrimental effect on the people, politically that is, and educationally, it's actually having it's uniting the people around that issue of fighting against the United States trying to force a regime change. Do you want to add anything to that, Joe?
Yeah, I think it's rallied the population. Now, the government, the Maduro government's also had a strategy of building a broad alliance. So some of those forces that were in opposition are now working with the government. I'd have to say that the main beneficiary in the opposition, or part of the opposition, uh, in December's elections was Democratic Action, which is sort of very vaguely something like the Labor Party in Australia, which is now arguing that they support in general the process. It's just that they can do it more gently. Yeah, that's a simple way of putting it. And they did increase money at the expense of the rest of the opposition. So that says something in itself. The population is not only about voting, it's about, and that's important, it's about the involvement in everyday life of the population. So we have in Venezuela a movement at the local level, at different levels, regional, national level, of millions of people actively involved in what they see themselves building a new society. So they feel they own it. They're participating in it. They're taking part in making decisions. So that is really critical to what's going on. The PSUV, which is translated into the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, is different to what we understand often outside a political party. It is a kind of federation of political political parties and organisations who have come together in a process because they found they've got more in common than they have differences, and and so. But there's also on top of that, which is called the patriotic power, which is people who, or forces, political party and forces who are not in the PSUV are also cooperating. That involves the great majority of the population. And of course, there's another force there, which is the indigenous peoples of Venezuela, who have been given a lot of autonomy. They make their own decisions. They have their own institutions. But there is a relationship there. They do support the government pretty overwhelmingly. Uh, well, from their point of view, they've been given sovereignty. Why shouldn't they appreciate it? Uh, so that is really the key to the survival, not only of the government itself, but also President Nicolas Maduro.
Yeah.
But it is still a hard battle.
Of course, anything worth winning is worth the struggle. It's never going to be easy, and when you have a dominant economic system that is trying to uphold itself and trying to maintain its dominance, it's going to fight back against countries that are trying to go down a road of independence. I think we can leave it there, Joe. We've touched on a whole range of issues, and for any of our listeners, feel free to make comment when you see the video. It's going to go up on the Venezuela webpage, Facebook page, and yeah, feel free to make comments. It would be great to have an interaction with people here in Australia. Which I guess actually before we finish up, Joe, we could talk very quickly about what we can do here in Australia in terms of supporting Venezuela, or in terms of opposing the sanctions that the United States is imposing on Venezuela.
Yeah, I think the first thing is to talk about it. Talk to people you know about it. And really change that discourse that's been around, that there's a dictatorship there, it's got to be overthrown by any means, blah blah blah, and so on. We need to pressure our own government that has connived in this, in terms of supporting Juan Guaido as the president. I mean, somebody who's got no authority. The reason why the United States no longer talks to him is that he can't do anything. He has no control over the institutions in Venezuela. There's still a network of embassies responding to, including Australia, to the existing Venezuelan government. He is no longer in the parliament. The little support he had before is pretty much gone inside Venezuela. And so we need to pressure our government to say, right, he does not represent Venezuela in any way. Uh, Another thing is that people can contribute to any campaign to help Venezuela. We should be encouraging normal trading relations like with any country. Now, the Australian government says it does not participate in the sanctions. Well, it doesn't directly. It doesn't make statements saying that we do not trade with Venezuela, or come out openly and say we pass laws that forbid people to do it. But behind the scenes, they do not exactly, well, say, discourage businesses from doing business with Venezuela. They take part in the financial system that that stops financial transactions and destabilizes the currency of Venezuela. So we need to pressure our government to say that is wrong, and we need to deal in trade with Venezuela in a normal way. That's two. Another way is people can get involved in some way, and they can contact the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign in Australia and see in which way they can help. That will come at the end of this on the credits. There will be details of how to get in contact.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so I think that it's been a fruitful discussion about what sanctions are about, how they affect people, and we were talking about Venezuela, but as Joe mentioned earlier, there are at least 30 countries that have been sanctioned by the United States, and who is the dominant economy at the moment. So it has an impact for these countries. Um, it sanctions generally, primarily, affect the general population, not the individuals, not the institutions that are sanctioned, but generally, but the general population, and that means you and me. That means poor people. That means people that work in farms. All of these things all of the sanctions have a huge impact on ordinary people. So we need to be demanding that these sanctions stop, and that these countries are allowed to develop in a way that their population decides. And that gets back to that whole question of democracy. So I think we've said enough,
Yeah,
Joe. I
yeah.
think we've covered.
Could I just mention something that should have been mentioned before very
Sure.
quickly, and that is a turning tide in Latin America at the moment. We have increasing number of countries that are not only not taking part in it, but they've been fairly active and they're building up their relationships with Venezuela and other nations. I'll include in this Argentina, even Chile. Of course, there's Nicaragua as well in Cuba, but there are other countries, Mexico. Uh, Now, there's two that are likely to have a major impact. One is Brazil, where there's a presidential election coming up, and there will be a change of government from all indications, and that will radically shift international relationships. The current president, Bolsonaro, he's been the number one ally of Washington. The other one, which is vying for number one spot, is in Colombia. Same thing there. And there's likely to be a change, or a very good chance of a change there. Now, they've both been staging grounds for, particularly Colombia, for attacks on Venezuela, economic and military sometimes, and that might change and have impact on the balance of forces. But I have to say that with Latin America going in this direction, and if it does consolidate and continue, that it's going to have an international impact as well. So stay tuned for that.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. And we will continue with these discussions. We will hold another conversation in 4 weeks' time, and we look forward to giving you more information on Venezuela. Thank you.
Until then.